Would you like greater happiness in your career, have greater influence, and be more effective? Would you like to be driven and not drained? That's our focus today, right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's free weekly e-newsletter, Unleashing Your Remarkable Potential, which is full of articles and resources to help you become a more confident and successful leader. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/newsletter. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Today, the word is motivation. I don't know any leader that wouldn't like to know a little bit more about what motivates their teams, what motivates them. And I have an expert with us today to talk about this important and interesting topic, the topic of motivation. His name is Chris Coultas. Let me introduce him now. If you're watching, now you can see him. Christopher Coultas is the Vice President of Product Innovation and a Senior Leadership Consultant at Leadership Worth Following, LLC. He personifies the scientist practitioner model in the fast-growing field of industrial organizational psychology. That means he's smart, everybody. He has coached hundreds of leaders and dozens of teams on how to leverage enhanced self-awareness for optimal leadership impact. He is the author of a valuable new book, Driven, Not Drained: Discover Your Path to to Career Happiness, Effectiveness, and Influence. That's quite a title. And Chris, welcome. I'm glad that you're here.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I'm glad to be here.
It's a great title. We're going to get into the book in a minute, Driven, Not Drained. But before we do that, when you were a kid, I see behind you a guitar. So maybe when you were a kid, you thought you were going to be a rock star. I don't know. But when you were a kid, I doubt that you thought you were going to become an industrial organizational psychologist.
No, you're right.
So I think I was pretty safe with that. So tell us a little bit about the journey that gets you to this place.
Yeah, definitely. So growing up, actually, I thought I was going to be a full-time Christian minister, thought I would be a missionary, something like that. And so I went to, my undergrad was at a Christian university, and I double majored in religion, but also in psychology. And I've always been interested in why people do what they do. I've always been interested in kind of the psychology of leadership and in organizations. So I've always been interested in that, but I thought my career would be in the Christian ministry field. And kind of as I dipped my toe into that water, I began to feel like that maybe I would not be as effective as I hoped I might be. And I also encountered a missionary actually who used business teaching to help organizations and to help people kind of learn a little bit more about the faith, but also just be more effective in business. And so I thought to myself that, hey, maybe learning more about business and learning more about how organizations are effective can be a way to marry the two. And so I started pursuing industrial organizational psychology and went and got my master's and PhD in that field from the University of Central Florida. And my dissertation was a little bit of a mix of motivation and leadership and culture and coaching. And so if you
we're going to talk about all those things today, Chris. So I didn't even know that. So we're in for a good conversation.
Yeah.
So that's where you end, that's how you end up here.
Yep, exactly.
So specifically, tell us about what led to the book. And you are the author, but it says underneath that, and like the whole organization. Clearly, this wasn't something you did solo. So talk about what led to the book and specifically sort of how the rest of Leadership Worth Following as an organization played a part in this the creation of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So even before the book, there's an assessment that we developed, and the assessment is called the DriV. So drive, driven, not drained. And the premise of the assessment is getting a sense of what drives you, what drains you, and what does that mean for your leadership. And so what led to the assessment? I can't really answer what led to the book until I answer what led to the assessment. And so we work with lots of organizations, assessing leaders, developing leaders, building teams, all that kind of stuff. And one of our clients wanted to know what motivates our team, what motivates our leaders. And there's one specific assessment out there that is kind of the big dog in this space, and I won't name it, but they didn't want to use it for lots of different reasons. And so for me, as kind of the young guy there at the organization, I just said, well, why don't we make our own? Why not? And so as we dug into it, was kind of seeing that there really needed to be a way to holistically look at a person to help them understand what drives them, not just what are they going to do behaviorally, but where do they get their energy from? What do they truly believe? And what's going to sustainably drive their motivation and energy? Not just, what are a couple of things they can do here and there, but where do they sustainably get their energy? So that's what led to the assessment itself, which then fed into the book.
Led to the book. So we're going to get to the model underneath the assessment in a minute, because that's really at the core of the book. But I want to get at this idea. The book says driven, not drained. That's the title. But I want to ask you a slightly different question. Driven versus drained. Is it just one or the other? Like, tell us a little bit more about that as an underlying idea.
Yeah. So the premise is that our energy is not an unlimited resource, but it is a renewable resource. And so when you're thinking about, what you're passionate about, where your energy comes from, where it goes, we really do want to find different ways to continually build up our energy. And, if you're not filling that tank, more likely than not, that tank is going to be draining. And I think one other interesting thing, since you brought up this question, and I've never heard it phrased that way, so you're making me think, which is great. I think one thing that is interesting on this idea of driven versus drained is one of the things that we really challenge people to think about as they dive into the book or the assessment or whatever the case may be is, are you going into what we call overdrive? And that's kind of our cute way of talking about it. But if you are overly pursuing something that drives you, if you are getting tunnel vision and just going after this one thing so hard to the extent that you're overlooking other things, you can actually paradoxically end up draining yourself,
right?
Because you're so heavy after this one thing.
Well, since I asked one question no one else asked, maybe I'll ask another. Maybe that's my goal, is I'll ask at least one more question that no one else asked you.
Awesome.
But like talk about this idea of driven and drained, driven, not drained, all that as it relates, because I opened by saying motivation, and then you mentioned it as well. Because to me, there's a big part of this book that's about what are the things that motivate us, what are the things that drive us. And so tie what you just said to the idea of motivation, if you would.
Yeah, so motivation is a big component of being driven, and I would say it's half of the equation. So when we talk about being driven, it's basically that feeling where your motives, your values, I suppose it's 1/3 of the equation, where your motives, your values, and your actual actions are all aligned. And so I think that when we talk about motivation, a lot of times what people really mean is that affective state, that emotional state of like, I feel excited about this. And that's a really good thing, but it may not be sustainable if it's not also aligned with what you're actually doing and what you believe.
Right.
what
If
your
it's not
values
rooted
are.
in those other things, right? Absolutely.
Mhm.
Aligned, rooted, pick your metaphor, right?
Right.
Okay. So we talked about driven versus drained. What about drained? Because that's language that, people can see it in a book. They can be listening to us and say, oh, yeah, I kind of get that. But here's a phrase that people are using all the time, maybe now as much as ever, is burnout. So what's the difference between drained and burnout, if there is one?
I would say probably not a ton of difference actually. I would say the idea behind drained may be a little bit more narrow, but the idea behind drained is just I'm kind of losing my energy. You're making me do something that is misaligned with my drivers, that it takes extra effort for me to do. And so, and maybe I had that backwards. Maybe burnout is more narrow. I'm not sure, but the idea
I've
behind
succeeded, everybody. I've asked him
there,
2 questions. No one's
yeah,
asked
there
me
you
4.
go. But yeah, I think the idea behind drained is you're doing something that causes you extra energy to do, and it drains your energy to engage in it. Now, can you do draining things periodically? Absolutely. If you
And in
do that
fact,
over
you
and
probably need to, right?
and that's yeah, and exactly that's a key part of the book and of the idea here is that knowing what drains you is critical, because those are the things we really try to avoid, but maybe we shouldn't, especially based on our context.
So let me just give a simple example to everyone listening or watching, and then you can comment on it. Here's an example that, as a leadership coach, you've heard it 100 times. Like, well, I don't really like conflict. Like, conflict is hard for me. And so that's a drainer. Yes.
Absolutely.
And not addressing it, not a good thing. Right. So do you want to say any more about that one specifically?
Yeah, so on the conflict side of things, there's a whole bunch of different things that feed into whether you pursue conflict or not. And one of the things in our model is the harmony driver, or the I'm driven by harmony. And so this is where like the drive and the drain concept do kind of overlap a little bit. But the idea is, if I'm really driven by harmony, I want to keep the peace. I want people to like me. I want to be really agreeable. A lot of times, because I'm so driven by that, I then also, on the flip side, avoid conflict, or I get drained by conflict.
Exactly. And as a leader, we can't just always avoid it, right? To your earlier point. So we're hinting at it. You mentioned the drive assessment, but the book really opens up page 15, I think it is. Page 15 with the model, the drive model. And you mentioned one of the 6 components being harmony. Just give us the very high level 30,000 foot view, basically, of the 6 components, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about leadership a lot already, and so that's a good place for us to start with impact. Impact is that drive to be assertive, to make an impact on the world around you. And actually, before I even get into the rest of them, I want to clarify one thing. A lot of these drivers, and we've already talked about drives versus drains, the premise of this is really around competing priorities. What's most important to you? And so if you're really driven by impact, that's because you are choosing, you believe it's more important to impact the world around you than it is to protect yourself, basically minimize risk. So there's pros and cons on all sides of these things, which is why I wanted to clarify that. So with insight, the next factor, the competing priority, or the tension here is, are you driven to be really big picture and be really innovative and new? Or are you driven more towards what do we already have? What's the concrete thing that we're wrestling with implementing? So I sometimes talk about it as ideating versus implementing within insight. Connection is that drive to establish connections with people. versus maintain your own independence. And so having kind of the freedom to disconnect at will would be a low connection approach. I've already touched a little bit on harmony. The flip side of that competing priority is basically keeping the peace versus making sure my own needs are met. Productivity is really interesting because a lot of times when people see that, they think of that as an inherent good. And so I have to be driven by productivity, or I'm lazy, or I am not productive, which is not the case at all, actually. And that's one of the paradoxical things that we see in our research, is that being driven by productivity means I get energy from doing stuff, being the doer of things. But we often find that as leaders go up the organization, their productivity driver goes down because they need to be the delegator of things. They need to be more flexible. And then the last one is meaning, and that's looking at how important is it to you that you're able to get significance and validation, something deeper than just like I go to work and I have my 9 to 5 and I get stuff done. I need it to be bigger, more missional, that kind of stuff.
So thank you for that, sort of giving people that basic construct, which is helpful because that's really the frame for your work and the frame for the book. So inside of that, inside of each of those components, harmony or productivity or whatever, there are qualities that you identify as the specifics, I'll say, inside of those things, those tensions inside of those. And there are 28 of those. And no, I'm not going to ask you to name 28. And no, I'm not going to make all the rest of you listen to 28. You need to go get a copy of the book, Driven, Not Drained. Okay. But you and I have been talking for 15 minutes. And so I'd like you to just pick one or maybe two, maybe that you just feel led to share for whatever reason, based on what we've been saying or what I've been asking or whatever. Just give us an example or two of what those are, about sort of the detail inside of those 6 areas.
Yeah, definitely. So let's touch on charisma. So charisma is one of the drivers that goes into impact. And the charisma driver is really about, do you get energy from being able to convince people or persuade them of things or inspire them? And I wanted to share this one because I think it's so fascinating, because it's one of those things.
It's the first one in the book, first of all.
Well, and that actually wasn't intentional, but it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, I'm actually very low on it. I think I'm a 3 out of 100 on it. And sometimes I think that surprises people because I do have to do some public speaking. I have to engage people, but it shows up for me because when I get into conflict, we talked about conflict a minute ago. When I do get into conflict, if it gets very emotion driven, if it gets very intense, I shut down pretty quickly because I don't communicate or inspire or persuade using that emotional channel. It needs to be more calm, cool, collected. And I actually have a friend on the other side of the spectrum who loves this stuff. He just gets fired up so easily. And what I coached him on was, if you are having fun in the midst of a debate, the other person probably isn't having fun because your threshold is so much different than the average person.
That's an excellent point. And you're making another point here, or you're alluding to a point, which is that take charisma as an example, that if it's a 1 to 100 scale, that if you take the assessment, all of us have a number. And so there's a range of where we fit there. And so talk about whether it's charisma or any other, it doesn't matter, right? Someone really high or really low. So take it out of the context of just charisma and just say, so if I'm a leader and I'm really high on one of these, what's the benefit and the risk for me of that being true?
Of you being really high or low on a
On a
specific
given
driver.
one, right? I mean, I think I know where you'll head, but like really strong in an area sounds like a good thing. Yes or no?
Yeah, so there's pros and cons with it. I think the extremes are where, from a developmental standpoint, really understanding like what your extremes are, either on the low or the high, is super helpful, because those are going to be the areas where you have the opportunity for maybe the greatest strengths. But I would say those are your high risk reward drivers, right?
Right. Great strength, perhaps, but also big blind side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned an unmentioned assessment earlier, and people that are watching or listening may be thinking, well, okay, there's 100 assessments out there. They may not be measuring exactly the stuff that Chris and the team are measuring, but where do strengths and preferences and all of that kind of stuff, measuring different stuff for sure. You know, Myers-Briggs and DISC and strength finders and tomatoes and colors and all that stuff. Like, where does all of that fit in, and how does that, maybe what I would say is, how does that connect with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for, if we're talking about strength specifically, so things like Strengths Finder, or possibly even the EQI, like emotional intelligence assessment, those are what I would call essentially competency-based assessments. Maybe if we're getting nuanced, there's a difference between those two specific ones, but the idea is that what are you good at, and higher is typically better on those kinds of assessments. And there's a place for those, but what the DriV is looking at is a couple of clicks back in kind of the chain, the behavioral chain, if you will. So we're getting at why you do what you do. And so I mentioned the EQI, for example. I would see those two like the DriV and the EQI, for example, pairing, because the EQI is going to say, here's where you're good, and then here's where you might have opportunities to improve. But the DriV is looking at why those may be strengths or opportunities, and maybe even like what your triggers are going to be, right? So if you're driven by creativity and someone shoots down your creative idea, well, now is probably a time for you to pull out your emotional intelligence toolkit, because you're about to get triggered.
Right. Makes sense. So I'm a leader sitting in an organization, wherever I'm sitting, high in the organization, middle of the organization, frontline leader, or if I'm just an aspiring leader, I'm an individual contributor and I'm listening to this. The question I might be asking is, Chris, okay, this all sounds great. Even if I go take this assessment, which of course you'd like us to do, and even if I buy the book and apply the ideas in the book, how do I use that? Like, how do I put these new insights and this new awareness of my motivations, if you will, or my motives? How do I put that into use every day as a leader?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways. So since you mentioned different organizational levels, I'll just give you one quick thought. You can use it to identify where your pain points might be as you're moving up the chain, so to speak. So and I'll just give you one quick example. I already mentioned earlier, productivity tends to go down as you go up. The productivity driver, at least, tends to go down as you go up the chain. And so if you're a frontline leader and you open up the book and you're like, man, everything about high productivity, I love it. I resonate with it. This is me to a T. Well, then you need to know going into it, if you're aspiring to the next level, you've got to be comfortable with letting things go. You've got to maybe lower your standards a little bit, or learn to delegate, or things like that. Practice some work-life balance. All of those kinds of things are going to be critical moving into the next level. So, yeah, I would. So that would be, I think, the first thing, and I'll pause after, because I could go on this question, but I don't want to take up all of our airtime. I think the other thing I'll say is just overall self-awareness as you're looking at yourself, and that's the intent of a book like this or an assessment like this, is to give you a kind of standardized, validated mirror, if you will, to look at yourself and to say, all right, I really like this kind of thing. I'm driven by this kind of thing, but it's tripping me up in XYZ areas. Now, behaviorally, what can I do differently to mitigate that? It's not about changing who you are. It's not about changing your drivers. But if there are some behavioral things you can do to mitigate those watchouts or those blind spots, then that's exactly the point of this book. Because I could do one-on-one coaching, but there's only so many hours in the day. So my best hope is that people pick this up and see some of the tips and the behavioral strategies that'll help them address some of those areas.
Help them help themselves. And so you said that at the start of the creation of the assessment, which eventually led to the creation of the book, that your client was saying, we want to know what's motivating our leaders, which we've been talking about. We want to know what's motivating our people. And so translate this, right? Because even if I take the assessment, I may or may not have all my team members take it. Let's assume I have awareness of this. I buy the book. I'm not going to able to whatever do that with my team. There's still tremendous insight from my perspective from the learning in this book, applying that to the motives of others. So make that transition or that connection for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually one of the main reasons why we structure this around 6 factors, because there's 28 things. Like, if you really want to get into it, there's 28 things, but to run through a mental checklist of 28 things every time you're engaging with someone is just not going to happen.
Good call. I agree, 100%.
But 6 is manageable, right? It falls within. There's some research out there that it's basically 5 plus or minus 2, right? Is what you can remember, and so we're falling right in that sweet spot there. And so, what I would encourage leaders to do is, as you're engaging with people, make a mental checklist of this. Or if you're a spreadsheet kind of person, have your journal, have your spreadsheet. But I think that as you're engaging with people, start to look for, where do people give you extra effort? Where do their eyes light up? Where do they really get jazzed up? And you can use this 6-factor framework of, they get really energized every time we talk about, they get really antsy every time we talk about a risk. Well, they're probably low impact. Right. They get really jazzed up every time we have a team activity. Well, they're probably high connection.
100%. I think it's a great way to think about it, and a very easy and accessible way for us as leaders to use your research and your work and the book. We're talking with Chris Coultas, the author of Driven, Not Drained: Discover Your Path to Career Happiness, Effectiveness, and Influence. And I have one more question for you. Well, I have several more questions for you, but one more specifically about your work and the book. And now we've talked about leaders. We've talked about individuals, but I want to ask you about sort of your team, thinking about our team culture and the drivers. What does your research say, or how could you inform us about our team culture, either the one we've got or perhaps the one that we want, and how that connects, or how the drivers can help us think about that, how the factors can help us think about that?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. One, when we work with teams, you can take the assessment, you can check out the book, and you get a sense of this is what drives the team. And the thing that I always the same challenge that you give to an individual leader is the same challenge that you give to a team. Because you may see that, we're really driven by collaboration, and we're really driven by courage, and we're really drained by deliberation. Like, okay, that's great. That's kind of who you are naturally, as a team, as a collective. Now the question is, how's that working for you? Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess we do overcomplicate decisions because everything has to be a team decision, and I guess we do move too fast and get impatient. And there's this dynamic tension between we want to be collaborative, but we also don't want to deliberate a bunch. And so the first step is as a team, really get some awareness around what's driving you, and then how is that working out behaviorally? And again, how can we implement some principles or processes or commitments that will help us find that balance between, yeah, we want to stay engaged and we want to be who we are, right? That's always nice, but we also want to perform at a really high level. So I think at a high level, that's kind of my big takeaway there. And then I'll leave you with one or two things quickly that are from the research in terms of what we've seen with teams. And I think one of the most interesting things I've seen is that the productivity factor within teams truly is something that you want a lot of variance on. You want a lot of mix in your team, because if you got everybody that's just execute, or everybody that's let's be flexible and delegate, if you've got only one end of the spectrum there, you're not going to get much done, but the magic happens in the mix.
That's a great way to say it. The magic happens in the mix. So I'm going to shift gears. We're going to leave the book. We're going to leave the research. We're going to leave the leadership. We're going to talk about Chris. And I want to know what you do for fun, Chris.
Oh, well, that's a good one. And because, and I have to bring us back to the assessment real quick, and I'm going to answer your question, but I score 1 out of 100 on enjoyment. So I'm not really
everybody. He doesn't even connect with this question.
So I'm not a hobbies guy, but what I do for fun is my wife and I have our 7-month-old, and is our first kiddo. And so for me these days, the fun thing is just going and playing with him and just seeing how he's growing these days.
And any of us that have been there in that moment know exactly what you mean. And some people that score higher than a 1 on the enjoyment factor are saying, that's why I can't do anything else, because that's where my focus is right now. Yeah. So I do know, though, there is something else that you do. What you may not call it for fun, but that you do it, and that is read. And so tell us what you're reading these days. What do you want to share with us?
Yeah. So what I'm reading right now actually is not really business relevant at all, but I've mentioned that I have a big Christian component to my life, a big faith component to my life. My wife is Catholic, was raised Catholic. I was not, and so one of the things that I'm reading is a book called Rome Sweet Home, and it's about a guy's journey who grew up Protestant and became Catholic through his kind of theological exploration. So I'm learning a little bit more about that journey.
Rome Sweet Home. That's a great title. I got to say that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I will tell you, Chris, you are the first person to mention that book on this show. So another first for today's episode. I love that. And actually I love it because almost every week, I mean, as you can probably imagine, there are, if you're a longtime listener, or for you, Chris, there are occasionally books that we hear or authors that we hear again and or often more than once, but most of the time it's always new and interesting stuff, which is one of the reasons why I asked the question. So now, speaking of questions, the question you most have wanted me to ask from the very, very beginning, Chris, where can people learn more about your work, get a hold of the book? Where do you want to point people? How do you want people to connect with you, etc.?
Yeah. Thanks. So real easy. You can just go to www.drivennotdrained.com. So that'll get you to the book website, and that'll also get you to the broader website, which has the assessment and some of the services and coaching and whatnot that connect to the book.
DrivenNotDrained.com or WorthyLeadership.com if you want to go directly to that and skip the book. But why would you want to skip the book? You should certainly start there. Driven, Not Drained. So, Chris, thanks for being here. Before we go, I'm not quite done with you, and I'm certainly not done with all the rest of you. And that is, I've got the question I ask you all every week. It's the question of application. Now what? What are you going to do with this? Maybe you're saying, hey, I want to go get this book. I want to go get this assessment. But maybe just thinking about this idea of what drives me versus what drains me. Maybe just thinking about one of the very specific things we might have talked about, like charisma or conflict or whatever. What are the things that you would take from the last 30 plus minutes that you will go apply? Because until you do that, this really doesn't have a whole lot of value other than sort of entertainment value. And, I think Chris and I both would say there's probably better ways for straight entertainment than what we've just done. So hopefully it was enjoyable for all the rest of you that are above a 1 on the enjoyment scale. But ultimately, you're here and we're here to help you become more effective, to become better, to become more confident as a leader. And all that's going to happen when you start to do something with what you learned, whether that's building on your self-awareness or whatever else it might be that you take from this episode. So, Chris, thanks again so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Before we go, everybody, let me remind you that today's episode was brought to you by Remarkable Master Classes. Each month, we release a new skill in an advanced form of a masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or learn how to get discounts for each individual month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And this has been another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And we'll be back again next week. Again. And so please come back and join us again. We'll see you next week.